Welcome to the Veterans Impact Show, where our commitment is to help, hope, and healing of our veteran family and our nation. I'm Jim Blythe, a U.S. Navy veteran and a certified senior advisor. Join us as we continue the mission of leadership and commitment to our communities and our great country. Why, you never know where we're going to go or who you're going to meet. We invite you to join in, plug in, and share in what we do. This is your Veterans Impact Show.
Welcome aboard. Hey, it's Navy Day. The fleet's in today. Captain Marc Liebman going to be on board with me, and he is taking Cedric's place today because we've got a special program about the National Defense Briefing Series. So we've got another Navy captain. Hey, Marc, how about introducing yourself real quick and then introduce our guest, please?
Okay, well, I'm going to tell you why they're here, and then I'm going to let them introduce themselves. But we've invited Cynthia Watson and Bud Cole to be the speakers at the National Defense Briefing Series August event because their expertise is the topic of the event, which is Great Power Competition, the People's Republic of China. And so what we thought to do is to bring two experts in. So Cynthia, let's do ladies first. Why don't you introduce yourself and give us a quick bio, and then Bud, would you do the same thing?
Hi, it's a real honor to speak with all of you today. I am Cynthia Watson, and I had the incredible privilege of teaching at the National War College for 30 years, and it's great to see you today.
Thank you.
I echo Cynthia's pleasure at being asked to do this, and I spent 30 years in the Navy, including a year in Vietnam with the Marine Corps, and then taught at National War College for 20 years. And my primary interest has been the Chinese military all these years. Delighted to be with you.
Well, thank you very, very much for being on board. So you served in the Marine Corps as well as Navy, and you were in both. Is that it?
Not exactly. I was attached as a naval gunfire liaison officer. I was a lieutenant junior grade to the Marine Corps in Vietnam for a year. I spent 5 months out in the field with an infantry battalion, and then went to join the artillery battalion at Quai San Combat Base during the Tet Offensive in 1968. Then I went back to the Navy.
I can imagine. You probably got tired of eating the crayons, right? I'm sorry about that.
No. Bad joke.
We've always
I
got
did
it.
get tired of eating sea rations, I'll tell you that.
I can only imagine. Well, the one thing good about ships is we got to take our chow hall with us. Marc, we're talking about this, and so you've got some key points that you want us to discuss that will lead into this National Defense Briefing Series. Would you get us started?
Sure. So the National Defense Briefing Series, for those who are not familiar with it, is a quarterly event put on by as a nonprofit to help educate citizens about critical national defense national defense issues. And we are nonpartisan. We also have a way to raise money, but we bring in speakers like Bud and Cynthia to help educate us about the issues facing this great nation of ours. So we've been doing this series called the Great Power Competition. We've done special operations. We've done the Navy. We've done the Air Force. We've done the Army. We've had people come and talk to us about Russia. We've had people from the Institute of Study of War come and talk about Iran and the Middle East. We've had ambassadors. We've had CIA station chiefs all come talk to us in the 23 or 4 programs that we've run. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to fire some questions at Cynthia and Bud and have them share their thoughts, because what we're going to do is provide some insight and as a kind of a preview as to what they would hear should they want to attend the event, which you can register at if you live in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. It's NDBS Inc.org, and then you go to the coming events, click on register. It's $50. It's at Heritage Ranch on a Sunday night. The dinner's halfway decent. It's better than decent. And the great thing about it is you will get to not only hear these two individuals speak and share their knowledge, but they will also take questions from the audience, which is always probably the most interesting thing. So with that introduction, Bud and Cynthia, I'm going to fire this at you, and you guys can figure out who wants to answer this. But I want to start with kind of an overview of where Xi Jinping thinks the People's Republic of China is going to be geopolitically in 10, 20, and 30 years from now.
I think he is relatively confident that China is gaining much, not all, but much of the respect that he sees as essential to continuing the control that the Communist Party has in China. He believes, and there's, I think, quite a bit of evidence for this, that the party has been the mechanism that raised China back from the century of humiliation since 1949, when PRC was first enunciated by Mao in October of 49. He knows he's got some domestic problems, and those are quite substantial. But China is increasingly taking a role as a partner in the sense of being called upon to deal with a number of issues around the world. And I think that's what he aspires to. And secondarily, he is trying to do everything he can to assure that China wouldn't revert to the vulnerabilities that allowed China to be seen as humiliated by the international community back in the period from about 1840 up until 1949. He's a long way from satisfying himself that everything is fine. He's certainly got challenges, but I think from all evidence, he believes that he is succeeding relatively well right now.
I'd like to add to that. What I think is the most important point for us when we look at the People's Republic of China is that the number one, in my view, the number one strategic interest, the number one strategic goal in Beijing is keeping the Chinese Communist Party in power. I think they sincerely believe that everything good that has happened in China since 1949 has been because of the Chinese Communist Party, and everything bad that has happened has been somebody else's fault, usually the United States. What that means, I think, to an American strategist or a military planner is that Beijing will be willing to make decisions that we might think are illogical if it means to them maintaining the strength of the Chinese Communist Party. And with respect particularly to our Taiwan, they might be willing to engage in a military conflict they're not at all confident they can win if they think the alternative is a weakening of their rule in Beijing.
Don't you think, if I can put in, don't you think that in regard to Taiwan, that they're working behind the scenes by bringing people in, getting more involved in the government, getting communists involved so basically take it over from the inside instead of having to take it over from the beaches?
Absolutely. The fellow who became Minister of Defense in 2000, whose name escapes me right now, thought that when he took office, he was going to do away with the Leninist nature of the Taiwan military. In other words, the Taiwan military is Leninist in that it has political commissars going along with its operators, just as mainland China does. And this fella, I was talking to a cousin of his, said that when he took office, he found that 200 junior military officers and cadets in the Taiwan Army had been born on the mainland and still had family back there. So he decided that they didn't embody the political reliability necessary. I'm sure that situation has changed with the passage of 25 years, but nonetheless, I am confident that that what you say is accurate. And furthermore, that if we give a weapon system or a sensor system to Taiwan, we might as well just assume that we're giving it to the mainland as well.
Let me add a slightly different perspective, but to back up what you're saying, I think we woefully underestimate China's willingness to use any and all instruments of statecraft to achieve their ambitions. They have used vaccine policy in the past. They did that during COVID. They have used unofficial embargoes against the Koreans when the Koreans decided in 2016-17 to deploy a THAAD system. That is all part of the belief that keeping the party in power is essential to keeping China strong. It doesn't make a lot of sense to us sometimes, but they will use any and all of the instruments available to them on Taiwan the way they would on anything else.
What you're saying, okay, Mark, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to come back to this whole issue of control a little bit later in the program, because I got about 3 or 4 questions that dive into this. But given that desire to maintain control, you have the Chinese economy is a have and have not. You have the special economic zones where you have entrepreneurs who have created wealth. Most of it's kept outside the People's Republic, in primarily U.S. and Canadian and British banks, but predominantly U.S. banks.
I'm not sure that's entirely true, Mark. There's a lot of money, but he has definitely been aggressive at trying to stop capital outflow in what's now almost 14 years in power. So it definitely exists, but I'm not sure I would say most of it is outside of China.
Well, the point being is that the Chinese economy is heavily dependent on exports. And yes, if he does any kind of kinetic action or even a soft coup, he is risking sanctions by 3 or 4 of his largest customers: the U.S., Japan, and Korea, and also Taiwan, which is the other 4th one. The 5th one's Hong Kong, which he already owns. And so those sanctions could cut his exports significantly, which would cause huge economic dislocation.
Back to Bud's point that what we see as rational isn't necessarily how they will make that decision, because the concern on the part of the party is that they will be held accountable for losing Taiwan, for it being permanently severed from the motherland. So I'm not sure sanctions would, in fact, after what happened with Tiananmen, when those sanctions were largely lifted within 18 months, I'm not sure that they think that would be that big a deterrent.
Interesting. Okay, so let me toss this on the table. So if I'm sitting in Beijing and I'm a member of the Central Military Committee, and I'm looking at the General Staff and the PLA, PLAN, and PLAAF, what would the takeaways do you think they are looking at from the capture of Maduro, Midnight Hammer, Epic Fury, and a couple other operations that have shown military prowess that in many ways the PRC has never demonstrated?
Well, I think if we go back to a little beyond that, if we go back to Desert Shield, Desert Storm, they were astounded by what they saw, because they assumed that since they really started trying to rearm after the break with the Soviet Union in the early 1960s, that they had made great progress. And they learned two important factors, I think, from Desert Storm. One was that they had not made enormous progress compared to what the United States and our allies demonstrated in that war, and that they had a very long way to go. And it taught them the lesson that they took to heart, and that was a prime motivator, I think, in the amazing progress that they have made since then. Now, countering that, as you recall, the 2008 financial crisis in this country and elsewhere around the world, they took from that the lesson that the U.S. was on a decline, whether it be economic, what they call national strength.
Comprehensive national power.
Comprehensive national power, an old Marxist concept that a nation's strength depends on not just the military, but economic and political and social and a whole raft of categories. I think they still maintain that belief that China's on the rise and that the United States is not. And then they look at something like the Maduro takeover, and I'm not sure what they think about that other than focusing on the illegality of it. And as far as the action against Iran is concerned, I quite frankly think that they're just laughing at us because of the illogic of launching the operation. And despite their contributions to Iran's military strength, I don't have a clear idea of how much they're really contributing to Iran as compared to, say, Russia, for instance.
I think
That's
that's real
interesting.
interesting. I think one of the things that what I'm hearing, and correct me if you think I'm wrong, is their real fear is a fear of their own people, because they have built up these economic zones in these areas where they've got some billionaires that have more money than we've got anywhere else in the world. And they're more afraid of their own people kicking them out. I've heard this and read this many times, that there's only one mayor in all of China who's communist and everybody hates him. So their fear is that their own people are going to kick them out if they don't come out as being the top dog. I think one of the things about Iran that I was reading from Brookings Institute, that they were pleased that President Trump came over to China and they had some diplomatic things. And so China now is being seen as at a level with the United States in trying to be a peace negotiator.
I think that it's important to consider the point you just made about fear of their own people. When you think about the internal surveillance, when you think about the money that they spend on those activities, that's in no way to say that China doesn't sow mischief around the world. That's not what I'm saying. They definitely do. But to a great extent, China has long been willing to stand back and let the United States, and back in the 70s and 80s when they didn't get along with the Soviets or the Russians after that, they were perfectly happy to let us and Moscow fight out things and let them stand back and see what they could consider a benefit for them. But the major difference between us is that China is interested in supporting China's ambitions, where we have historically been more involved, or at least we believed we were more involved in trying to establish global norms, and they don't think in those terms.
All right, Cynthia, we'll come back and address these issues that we're talking about. This is the Veterans Impact Show, and we're going to take a break to hear from our sponsors and those that support us. So this is your Veterans Impact Show. Join us, share us, and be a part.
Welcome back, and thanks to our great sponsors, Fairway Independent Mortgage, Healing Thine Heart's Ministry, and Symbios Integrative Health. Now, let's get back to this conversation.
It's a fascinating conversation because of all of the dynamics that are going on in the world right now. So, Mark, I've kind of jumped in, and I'd like for you to continue with your train of thought that we've been going down that rabbit hole.
Okay, so I'm going to keep going because I think we've actually struck something that was oddly enough aligned with some of the questions that I had prepared. So we've talked about at length about that the primary role of the CCP is to control the population, and anything that threatens that or puts that at risk, so to speak, and endangers their power, could lead to a change in direction or change in leadership, possibly. So the next question I got is, what does Xi think and is the greatest threat to his position in power, or the party's position in power?
Well, I think that the first thing Xi Jinping and leadership think about in the morning when they wake up is not the U.S. or not Taiwan. It's how many incidents of civil unrest have occurred, major incidents of civil unrest have occurred in China in the previous 24 hours.
Wow.
This goes to their concern for their own population's satisfaction. They're not so cynical that they don't care about that. China has, as Cynthia can attest with numbers, China has set an amazing number of hundreds of millions of its population, lifted them out of poverty. But I think what they have established in China is a sort of unspoken deal, if you will, where the people stay out of the government and the government will allow them to flourish economically and socially and just to do better. And I think that has been effective generally to date.
Let me just add that the reason that's so threatening, Mark, is because that economic process that you talked about earlier, that is dependent on exports, is not thriving the way that it was 20 years ago. The population has decreased, so there is not cheap labor anymore. The international community isn't buying, is more conscious of buying things from China than they were. And so there's long been this conversation about whether the Chinese model can continue. Well, let's say the model doesn't continue. And let's say that unemployment, which is already relatively high for the younger population, let's say it continues to rise. That could be something that worries the party a great deal, because they by all evidence, and it's hard to know anything in China because it's a deliberately very opaque system. So we can speculate, but we don't know a lot of things. But it does raise the question, were they comfortable in 1989 when they had to send troops, Chinese troops, against the Chinese kids who were near Tiananmen or on Tiananmen Square? By lots of evidence, they weren't. Well, would they want to do that again in the future? They've restructured. They have really invested in the People's Armed Police instead of using the PLA if that were to arise. But it's still a core question about what is the party thinking about how to deal with their own population in some period of unrest.
So
Boy,
you've actually touched on literally the next question that I had, which is, okay, how healthy is the Chinese economy? I mean, I've seen all kinds of data and stories about it's overbuilt from a housing perspective. The one-child policy is now causing an aging population. I mean, there's all kinds of other issues. So, and the word you used was opaque when you talk about numbers from China. The word I would use was be deliberately misleading. But
well, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So anyway, what are the economic issues that the PRC is struggling with today, and what are the cultural issues?
You are absolutely correct that there are still ghost cities that you can ride through on a train going from Beijing up to Shenyang, which is in the northeast, that astound you, because you go by just building after building after building that are 40 stories high, that are empty, and by all indications are going to stay empty. You definitely have an aging population. China is projected by the end of this century, which is now only 75 years away, they're expected to go down to a population of 800 million from 1.3 billion. That's astonishing. And there's not a whole lot they can do about that. They definitely have over leveraged urban budgets to an incredible degree. But because it's a closed system, and because we are not entirely sure, and I'm not sure they're deliberately misleading. They definitely don't want anybody to know the true numbers. No question about that. But when I say opaque, what I'm trying to say is that we don't see their decision-making process. That's simply because they make a decision and then they implement that decision. That's why transparency is so important in governing. But what we do have some evidence for is that the party has been struggling with this. There have been some economists who have come out and said Xi Jinping's way, which is to put the party above everything else, including economic reform, is not a good idea. Will the party decide that they simply can't tolerate what he's doing? That's a possibility. Doesn't seem likely right now. But this is what I mean about opaqueness. We can't really see what some of the alternate paths are that they could take and how they can.
Let's take a break. I want to say a special thank you to Fairway Independent Mortgage, the company I work for. My MLS number is 311-548. And Symbiosis Integrated Health is doing a lot to bring veterans back from pain and all of those things. This has been a great, great opportunity. We're talking with Bud Cole and Cynthia Watson. They're going to be our featured speaker in August for the National Defense Briefing Series. Go to National Defense Briefing Series and you can find out more. So we'll be right back after these messages with Marc Liebman and all that he does to keep us informed. So thank you, and we'll be right back after these words.
Welcome back, and thanks to our great sponsors, Fairway Independent Mortgage, Healing Thine Heart's Ministry, and Symbiosis Integrative Health. Now, let's get back to this conversation.
Cynthia, we interrupted it to take a commercial break. Can I ask a question that we can kind of shift gears for a second? Because it's sort of, being a Texan, near and dear to my heart. I don't think China is energy independent by a long shot. That's the best I know. And so they have been dependent a lot on Iranian oil. Now we're trying to say, hey guys, guess what? We've got an oversupply. We'll ship it to you. Is this, in terms of imports, also having an effect on their policy, that all of a sudden they're energy dependent and we're cutting it off and with Iran?
I'm going to turn that over to Bud because he's written a lot more on energy than I have, Jim.
They are concerned, certainly, Jim. They have been getting 20% of their sort of daily energy requirements through Iran, and very, very little, parenthetically, from Venezuela. That's been much more of a political acquisition than an economic acquisition for the very heavy type of oil that's produced from Venezuela. But they are concerned about the Strait of Hormuz being closed. There was an article just the other day, however, that Saudi Arabia and Oman have figured out a way to bypass the strait. Admittedly, if it's by pipeline, it won't be as rapid, but it's a possibility. China is also one of the reasons I think Putin came to Beijing last week or week before, was to help finish off the contract to double the natural gas flow from Siberia to China, which is a very old project. China also in the late 1990s began the construction of 6 very major energy reserve systems in China, depots in China. They now have at least 90 days of supply, I suspect, and maybe more. I don't know how many of those above ground reserves they have built. So they've got a nice cushion. Sure, they're concerned, but I don't think they're worried right now about any fatal effects from it.
A buddy of mine who is an oil and gas economist says that the drain on their system, those stockpiles they built up, they must have known Iran was going to happen before it happened, because they built up stockpiles are diminishing rapidly. Another thing I've often wondered about, and all of you may know a lot more than I do, but I was told many times that one of the reasons China wants so much power in the South China Sea is the Mekong Delta in the south, off of the coast of Vietnam, is one of the largest oil fields in the world that Dutch Shell knew about. I don't know if that's true or not. My cousin was a master driller and was drafted in the Army, and he was out drilling water wells in the Mekong Delta, and he just kind of smiled when I asked him. And I think there's a lot more to that than anybody knows.
There are certainly major seabed energy reserves in the South China Sea. They were first surveyed in detail by the Japanese before World War II. China right now has been searching avidly in that area, as have Vietnam and the Philippines and others for decades now, and they haven't found any sort of huge gold mine. Last time I looked into detail into South China Sea reserves, been a number of years ago now, but the estimates ranged wildly. There was one estimate by a Chinese think tank that was about 50 times greater than the World Bank estimated. I think the World Bank estimates remain modest. There's certainly valuable reserves there, but it's not going to be a Golconda of some sort of satisfying everybody's desires.
Well, the other thing about Vietnam, it was the Rice Bowl of China for the Rice Bowl of Southeast Asia. So there are food supplies there that I'm sure they want to tap into as well.
Well, actually, they can't. And the reason that they can't is by their own making. This is the law of unintended consequences.
Wow.
What we haven't talked about at all is that China is desperate for water. They have a real desertification problem in the north of China. They have a real problem with Beijing being overrun by the Gobi Desert. There are whole swaths of the country that have already pumped out the aquifers under the cities. So China has been diverting water from the Himalayas, from those 5 rivers that go into Southeast Asia. China's been trying to divert the water up to its more populated areas. And one of the places that the United States back in the 1990s made an effort, 1990s into the first decade of the 21st century, to help Vietnam figure out what to do about rising water levels in conjunction with the declining Mekong so that they could continue to grow rice. So that the real danger is actually for Vietnam being able to be self-sufficient in rice, because China has decided water is more important and that they can find foodstuffs in other places.
This brings me to an interesting conversation. There's really 2 parts to this. One is when Xi is talking to his, I'll use the word, his insiders, his inner circle. What does he really think of Russia? Because my view is that he's now viewing Putin as a junior partner whose only purpose in the world is to sell them oil, and Putin is oil and gas, and Putin is embroiled in a war he no longer can win. So what does Xi think about Putin? That's number one. Number two, who does the PRC see as its allies, and could you kind of rank them?
Well, I think that Russia and China historically have been antagonists, if not outright enemies. There was a brief period of peace between them in the early 1920s, and then it would finally, after Khrushchev went away and the Cold War basically ended, I'd say probably in the very late 1980s, they have now become what they like to call strategic partners. I think you're essentially correct in that as far as Xi Jinping and other leaders of China in the past couple of decades are concerned, they have sort of a market economy look at primarily the energy reserves in Asia. And that's their number one interest. There is a certain amount of cross-border trade, as well as Chinese farmers who have moved up into Siberia across the Amur River. But right now, and the other factor I mentioned is that in the 1990s, particularly, China spent a lot of money and made a lot of effort to acquire Russian weapon systems, both ships and aircraft and engines, particularly, and so forth. That has begun to ease considerably as China's own armaments industry has progressed and modernized. So I think Xi Jinping probably considers Putin to be a source rather than any sort of political master or wise man.
I would also add that long border between those 2 states, which is a very porous border, includes lands that the Chinese historically claimed were theirs, and that the Treaty of Nerchinsk that was signed and ceded those lands to Russia is not something that some Chinese ultra-nationalists would not like to reverse. Nationalism lives in lots of parts of the world. And if I were Putin and I were looking at a map and I were looking at how empty it is out there, particularly with Russia's similarly declining population, I would be worried about the fact that Northeast China has relative access to those areas of Siberia. And that's probably something that doesn't make the Russian military very happy. I would also add that not just is China's military more able to produce its own weapons, but the reason that they were a marriage partner in the early 90s was because both of them were on the outs with everybody. And the Russians needed the money the Chinese could provide, and the Chinese couldn't buy from us after Tiananmen.
As far as
You're good.
Go ahead, bud.
okay, as far as allies are concerned, Xi Jinping is in North Korea as we speak. Kind of a loose definition of the word ally to describe that in North Korea, since they're much more of a dependency. Other countries that I suppose one can consider allies include such powerhouses as Laos and Cambodia. Pakistan's a little bit different story, but it gives Beijing significant leverage in South Asia. And of course, then there's Russia, which, as we've just discussed, is a major source, or can be an even greater source, of both energy and some other valuable minerals.
So just as an aside, the Chinese, or excuse me, the Russians, traditionally what they sold to the Chinese on the brochure, so to speak, and what they delivered tended to be somewhat different. And there's instances like during the Vietnam War where the Chinese were getting one version of the SA-2 and SA-3, and the North Vietnamese were getting a much more improved one, and yet the Chinese were paying through the nose for it. And then there are Russian submarines that they sold to them that were not of a high quality. We'll just leave it at that. So I don't see other than some very narrow areas where Russia and the PRC are going to get much past the political statements, except in a very few areas. Energy is one, minerals another. You brought Cynthia, you brought up a wonderful point about the vast area on the Amur River north of Manchuria, which the Chinese have traditionally claimed. And so I want to slightly shift gears a bit. So there's been a lot of articles written in speculation in the American or the Western press about the purges in the PLA, and by PLA I mean the Army, Navy, and Air Force. What do you think drove those, and what do you think the effect is of those?
I think it was a straightforward attempt by Xi Jinping to get rid of some extremely corrupt senior military officers and political officials. Stuff that has gone on for decades there. And of course, as the more wealth accumulated because of the booming Chinese economy, then the corruption increased. Now, the focus is primarily on financial corruption. Understandably, that's the most obvious. It's not astounding, but it's really significant how many senior military officers Xi Jinping has banished. And we're talking about 3- and 4-star equivalent generals and admirals. We don't see quite as much attention paid to some of the senior civilian officials, but they haven't escaped either. My favorite story goes back about 5 or 6 years when the vice admiral in their Navy, who was in charge of logistics, was supposedly found with a hoard of gold bars in his basement of one of the several houses he owned. That's pretty hard to ignore, that level of corruption. But I think from a military perspective, a more important form of corruption is what I call operational corruption. You know, if you're commanding officer of a ship or a unit in any of the military services, and the big guys come down to assess your readiness, and maybe the senior observer, the senior grader, is your wife's third cousin, and therefore he doesn't give you an honest opinion of how ready or unready your unit is. This is what I would call operational corruption. And I think I don't know how pervasive it is, but I think it is present, and I think that worries Xi Jinping as well.
One of the things that Oh, I'm sorry. Go
Let me
ahead.
just add, Mark, that when he came into office in November of 2012, Xi Jinping, by all indications, understood that for the average person on the street in China, they considered the CCP, and by extension, its armed wing, which is what the PLA is, to be corrupt. And there are some who argue that what he was trying to do was clean that up because he recognized, back to the party staying in control, that if the population so distrusted them over corruption, then how did they know that that wouldn't spiral out of control further? So it's a hypothesis. We'll have to see how it plays out, but it certainly makes sense when you look at the levels of corruption that we're seeing, except one would think after he'd been in power for 14 years, it would have diminished, and clearly it hasn't.
Yeah, so
Well, if you look back over history, let me throw it. If you look back over history, the tremendous difference, for instance, in Russia and in China, between the high echelons, those that were in the royal class, those were at the top of the heap, and the peasantry below. And that has always bred a certain amount of corruption in any culture. And that's been one of the things that Mark, all of the people that we've met with that are military have said the biggest problem with both the PRC's military and the Russian military is they don't really have an infrastructure like we do. You know, the statement is, and Bud, you can answer this, who runs the Navy? The chief petty officers, you know? And we've got an infrastructure that is very deep, and training is very deep. And everything I've heard, Mark, from all of the people we've talked to is both of those countries have a really crappy military leadership.
Well, I can't speak directly to the Russian example, but one of the most common questions I'd be asked in the late 90s or early part of this century, when I used to meet with the Chinese naval attaché or his assistant, maybe 2 or 3 times a year, is how does our retirement system work? And how does one go about creating a non-commissioned officer corps that has real power? And none of this was classified. I was always careful, obviously, to answer in publicly available information. But they took, they just weren't talking to me. They were talking to everybody they could and looking. We had pretty good military-to-military relationships then, so they were able to observe firsthand. One sea story I'll tell is when I was escorting the president of China's National Defense University, we got out to visit the 25th Infantry Division in Hawaii, and the division commander put on a show of a sniper team. And you couldn't see these kids. They were so well camouflaged. And they did a little demonstration that was very impressive. And then they were called in to meet the Chinese general. And the thing that most intrigued him and drew the most questions was the leader of that sniper team was an E5 staff sergeant.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, E5 sergeant. And in the Chinese military, that would have been probably a first lieutenant or a captain equivalent.
All right, let's stop for just a second because we're going to need to take another break to hear from our partners. We want to carry this forward because it's important to know about our adversary's military. So this is your Veterans Impact Show. We'll be right back after these words from all of our partners. Thank you for being on board. Thank you for being part of Veterans Impact Show. Welcome back, and thanks to our great sponsors, Fairway Independent Mortgage, Healing Thine Hearts Ministry, and Symbios Integrative Health. Now, let's get back to this conversation. Captain Cole, continue that conversation before I had to interrupt.
Okay.
Yeah, then I want to ask him a following question. Go ahead,
They took that lesson to heart, and since the early part of this century, they have created, apparently have created, a much stronger NCO corps. Now, one of the concrete things they did was, I guess about 30 years ago, the longest an enlisted person could serve in a PLA, I think, was 17 years. You don't grow, senior NCOs in that period. That no longer is the case. I think they can serve 30 years now. Now, how effective their campaign has been, I can't say. but they did set out to create a stronger NCO Corps. The same, what little I know historically from the old Russian army is that typically the officers were assigned duties that in a Western military would be performed by senior enlisted guys. I just don't know if that continues or not.
But the at least going back to my days on active duty and also some of the research and consulting I did later on, the PLA has a dual command, and I'm using PLA in the generic Army, Navy, Air Force, has a dual command structure. You've got commissars at every level who are evaluating I'll use the word, the regular service officers and enlisted, and they have a different reporting chain. They can override, in some cases, decisions made by the military side, and also the promotions. Let me phrase this correctly. One of the criteria for promotion is one's political reliability, and by that I mean in terms of the party. So, in times of conflict, when you have dual chains of command, forget the cultural issues, which I don't want to dive into, which is the concept of face, because that's a whole day's worth of conversations. How does that play out? Because it's going to hamstring the field commanders big time.
Well, the Chinese understand the possible conflicts. Napoleon was the first one, as far as my limited knowledge is, to employ this sort of dual command structure to a degree. And of course, the Russians, after the 1917-18 revolutions, emulated it. It's not totally separate chains of command in the sense that there is cross-training between operators and political officers. If you take a destroyer, for instance, where you'd have 4 departments, each department would have a political commissar, political officer assigned, and then there would be the commanding officer would have a political commissar assigned. I have been on about 10 or more warships since 1994, Chinese warships, and I've seen a difference in the relationship. In some ships, it seemed like the operational commander would do whatever he thought best for the ship, and this is a very, very brief insight. Other ships, it didn't look to me like the captain would even make a head call without the political commissar's agreement. I think it's too easy, on the one hand, to overestimate this as a weakness in the system, and I'll give one example. But on the other hand, I think in a hot tactical situation, if the operational and the political commanders aren't really matched in their training and their knowledge and their intent, that there could be a problem. The example I'll give is back in the 90s, at one point, some senior Chinese Air Force officers went down to Maxwell Air Force Base. And they were given a tour. And of course, as many folks know, there's many of the Air Force schools are down in Maxwell. And they considered the fact that the chaplains had a school down there and so forth to be a political effort. And they also believed that in the Navy, we used to have something called general military training, in which we'd hold daily, weekly sessions, if my memory serves, and things like treating minorities and women equally, getting out the vote, knowledge of the U.S. government. These were interpreted by these Air Force guys as political training. So again, I personally think there's a potential for weakness in this system, but I think it'd be too easy to overestimate it.
I want to shift gears totally, because you and I are both Vietnam. Huh?
I said we haven't got much time.
That's fine. You and I are both Vietnam vets. Since you're more senior than me, you were there before I was. But you wrote an interesting book called Going to Nam. Tell me why and what the book's about, because a lot of people don't understand. I know what an Anglico team is. So give us a few seconds on the book, why you wrote it, and how did it affect your view on the PRC?
Well, I went over the first time in summer 1966 as boat group commander for the amphibious raiding group, which meant that I was leading amphibious assaults along the coast and also did some considerable ops on the Cuvier River way up north, and also in the Cochin down in the Mekong River Delta, which was which was fairly exciting, but also fairly low intensity combat. Then I then was followed up by the Navy deciding I should be a Naval Gunfire Liaison Officer with the 3rd Marine Division in country. So as I said earlier, I spent 5 months with the 1st Battalion, 3rd Marines, and then went up to Quezon and afterwards with 1st Battalion, 13th Marines. Took a long time for me to be able to sit down and write this book, I think. It's nominally a novel because, frankly, I just couldn't remember everybody's name that I served with, so I had to make up a lot of names. I think the book's probably 90 to 95% accurate, other than that. And there's a lot of pathos in the book, both because of personal experience and stories I've had from others. The most fascinating one was the book was read by a former enlisted Marine, and he contacted me and he said that the chief thing that surprised him from the book was that the officers thought the same about the war as the enlisted guys did.
Well, guys, I got to tell you, it's time I've got to bring this ship back into the dock. This program has been great. We're so thankful to you guys for coming on board, Dr. Cole and Dr. Watson. And we look forward to seeing you in August at the National Defense Briefing Series. And Mark, thank you so much for being on board and helping to lead this. This has been a great program. So again, go to National Defense Briefing Series. And then Mark, by the way, buddy, you got a new book called Retribution. So why don't you come on in the next month and let's talk about retribution. So thank you again. I want to say great. We close with a prayer. Lord God, we just thank you for all that you do for us and putting a hedge of protection around our active duty military and those who run into the fire. And we say, thank you, God, for bringing us all back together, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, and thank you for being a part of Veterans Impact Show. Have a great day, and follow us, be a part of the movement. Thank you.
Our pleasure.